Hello, thanks everyone for having me. So if you've seen the schedule, you've seen this is the name of the talk, but because I'm an idiot and I listen to people I respect, one of my coworkers who's here today, like sort of nerd sniped me into just like completely changing the talk. So if you like this talk, you can see, I did it before, so you can go like to this link and watch a video, preferably not while I'm doing the talk right now. Or at least like wear headphones or something. Like I've tried to make it so that the bits where you laugh will be exactly the same in each talk. So if you wait, we'll start at the same time and then everything should go a little bit better. This is the actual talk I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about what I call Ruby on guardrails, which is the way we've been building stuff at my new gig at Workbrew, and generally the kind of guardrails that exist already in the Ruby ecosystem, how we've been leaning into them super hard, why I think that's a good idea, why you might want to try at least doing some of that too, and why you should love guardrails. So firstly, I want to hear about you. So there's going to be a bit of hand raising during this talk. I apologize in advance. If you write Rails stuff mainly for work, can you put your hand in the air, please? Okay, lots of people. If you write Ruby stuff for work that is not Rails, can you put your hand in the air? Okay, a few people. If you write Ruby in your free time, put your hand in the air. If you haven't already put your hand in the air, put your hand in the air. Anyone who put their hand in the air in the last batch, just shout out, why are you here? What are you doing? Like, I'm actually genuinely interested. Someone shout something out. We had lunch together, so you can shout something out. There we go, getting back into it. Great reason. Thank you very much, sir. Right, so me, I got a lovely introduction from James already, but I'm going to introduce myself as well, because why not? I've been spending too much time around Americans, so you need to big yourself up, sell yourself, all that type of stuff. So I'm an engineer based here in Edinburgh, and I'm going to talk about a few Ruby projects I've worked on to begin with, and then I'll talk about what I've sort of learned and the guardrails through that. So Homebrew, I've worked on since 2009. Those of you who might not have used it or heard of it already, it's a Mac OS primarily, but nowadays Linux as well, package manager for open source software. I started working on it about 5 months in. A few of the previous talks have kind of resonated a little bit with me today. Like it started, I guess, as Ollie said, as my kind of creative side project. And it started off being low risk, low pressure, labor of love. It's still a labor of love, but it's not really the other things. And similar to how Ayush said he found kind of Bridgetown, like in my case, the story there was very similar in that I was sort of trying to hack something around Mac ports to work essentially in the way that I later learned out that Homebrew worked. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to abandon my own crappy solution and go and get involved with this thing instead. And I guess for me, again, there's been encouragement already today to get involved with open source. Also would heavily recommend it. The way I got into it, which I still think is the best way to get into it, is the expression we used to use back in the day of like scratching your own itch. Find a problem that you already have and try and solve that problem. Don't go out trying to solve other people's problems for them because you feel good about doing that or because you want a big green contribution graph or something on your CV. Like you're not going to be motivated unless it's actually solving a problem for you. So sometime after Homebrew, I got my first job where I was actually paid money to write Ruby. And I worked at this company, Old Trails, for a couple of years. I was employee number 8, so it was a nice little small startup environment. The Rails app was probably only a year and a half, 2 years old at this point. And then I went on fairly quickly from there to work at GitHub, where I was for 10 years. I left as a principal engineer last year, and I worked on their kind of huge Ruby on Rails application. And yeah, learned a lot of stuff about Ruby at scale, and yes, Ruby does scale, and how to do things well, and sometimes how to not do things so well as well. And then nowadays, I left GitHub last year, started a company with some ex-GitHub people, which we're calling Workbrew, which is basically, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute, but basically we're building a Ruby on Rails application from scratch as our kind of like cloud part of what we're building. It looks a little bit like this. It's basically a Rails application for kind of businesses to be able to view all the packages installed across all their devices in their fleet. If you're already running like an MDM solution, Jamf, Kanji, whatever, it integrates nicely with those and basically just provides kind of Workbrew support and integration for those tools where they're already lacking. And there's a pricing slide because capitalism or something. If you're interested in learning more about this, send me an email. I will happily tell you more. That's the pitch done. Don't worry, I won't do it again. Right, so let's start with some background on what I was saying before. So no, that's not the right one. Homebrew doesn't actually support this version anymore, so we can't do this. Okay, this one's fine, right. So why am I even here? Like, why am I doing this talk? Okay, so I think we have like a fundamental tension in Ruby land, right? I would assume it's common knowledge for basically everyone in the room at this point that like Ruby is pretty great. Like Max already spelled out a bunch of reasons today why we all love Ruby. I imagine we share some or all of those ourselves. And I think part of the thing that for me makes Ruby really good is because it's such a kind of, once you get familiar with it at least, you can move really, really fast. Developer productivity is really high. Developer happiness is really, really high. I'll talk more about that later. But it's also really good at like breaking things, right? I guess I don't imagine this was what Zuck was referring to back in the day, I guess particularly because it's a PHP shop. But what I mean is, as I say, this is very much coming from a like, you know, we're all Ruby people here. It's like with my brothers or when I see my kids together, you know, I can talk shit about Ruby because I love Ruby, right? We're not gonna let the node people say it's rubbish, but we can, in this closed room, we can say these things, right? How many of you have seen errors like this, right? If you've seen an error like this less than about 1,000 times a year, then you're a considerably better programmer than me. I'm sure we've all lost non-trivial amounts of our lives being like, oh, turns out, like, I didn't check for nil in this particular place, and that happened. That's like the thing, right? Like, it's, for all that I love about Ruby, this is the most consistently annoying thing. And if there's one takeaway from this talk, it is, okay, I'm gonna point you to ways that you might be able to see fewer or maybe even none of these in future. So if you've worked with a compiled language like, you know, Go or Rust or whatever, the compilers are pretty good at like spotting these types of issues and giving you a decent like heads up. It's a compile time thing. These types of problems don't make it as often into production. But like the Ruby interpreters, you know, it's good at what it does, but you can say, hey, Ruby, read this file, make sure everything looks okay, the syntax is all right, and then until you're actually running that code, you have no idea whether it works. So I guess the common kind of maybe Ruby ecosystem solution to this is like, cool, we'll write lots of tests, right? And I think that's good. I think let's write tests. Please write some tests. But I think there's more than that we can learn on, and maybe even a way to write fewer tests. So I'm going to basically tell you what, you know, we're doing pretty good. We're like 9 minutes in on this talk, and I'm going to tell you the solution to the problem, right? Are you ready? Oh, no, it's not actually as simple as that. Okay, so obviously, like anything in engineering, right, anyone who tells you that like there's an easy solution, you just need to do X, and if you do X, it will solve all your problems, is either like a noob or trying to sell you something, or, I don't know, smarter than me. But what I'm going to talk about is what do I want to optimize for? Like, why am I going in the direction I'm going on? Why do I care about Ruby on guardrails, as I call it? So for me, in descending order of priority, the most important thing, perhaps controversially, is developer happiness, right? Again, this is partly comes out maybe my working at developer tools companies, right? And even more so in open source, because in open source land, like, I can't make anyone do anything, right? Like, I can stop people from doing things. I can, like, make an aggressive request changes on a pull request and be like, thou shalt not pass, or whatever. But if I can't say to someone, hey, like, I would really like you to spend the next month working on this refactoring that's really overdue. So ultimately, people need to be relatively happy in open source land, or they're not going to do stuff at all. And in work land, again, well, I mean, certainly if I was giving this talk 2 or 3 years ago, but even somewhat now, if people aren't happy, they will leave and be able to get trivially a better job elsewhere. I'm sure everyone in here is like a super amazing engineer, so I'm sure none of you would have any problems with that. Right, number 2, customer/user happiness. Again, perhaps controversially, like this is below developer happiness. Again, for me, this is why I think tools like Ruby are important, is, you know, if I still think that's the best way to build customer and user happiness, but you're optimizing first for making the developers happy and productive in what they're doing. Thirdly, again, maybe slightly controversial, velocity-quality balance. I'm sure we've all worked with some engineers on either end of this spectrum, people who move really, really fast, just vomiting out page after page of code that sort of works, but then is impossible to maintain and fix and debug and whatever. And then on the other end, actually probably equally as problematic, but not quite as shamed by our community, I guess, is the people who will fixate on making sure everything in every PR is exactly perfect, and if there's one piece of white space that's not quite right, then we're going to block this PR that would deliver customer value today for another month just while you fix the white space. Yeah, not good either. We need to find out some sort of happy middle ground. And the last thing for me is, I'll talk more about this a little bit later on, I'll just leave it as it is for now, but this idea of robot pedantry, human empathy. Okay, so let's drill into these a little bit. Like, what do I actually mean when I say these various things? So developer happiness, said before, keep the developers happy or they will quit, and then you'll have to do it by yourself. That doesn't sound good. For me, that is why I use Ruby and why I think others should use and like using Ruby, because it's pretty much the only language and ecosystem that feels really, really aggressively optimized for developer happiness. And I feel like as a community, we lean into that pretty hard as well. And I think there's a reason why so many people in this room and in the Ruby wider ecosystem have stuck with Ruby even when it's not cool anymore, right? But I think there's still more we can do, and I'll get to that later. And then, okay, customer, user happiness. Okay, customers generally want software that works. And what I mean by software that works is it's going to have some bugs. Ideally, as many bugs as possible are caught in test environments, development environments, whatever, before they get into production, and the bugs have to be experienced by customers. But if they do get into production, then customers generally want a low MTTR, which has helpfully two different meanings, of which I'm going to pick one. Mean time to repair. So basically, the time from them discovering that bug to that bug being fixed and the fix being rolled into production. If you can get that time really nice and small, then your customers are going to be much happier. We're in the stage of a business where some of our customers are so elated about having a fix out 20 minutes after reported, like it almost makes me want to add more bugs. They seem happier with the bug being fixed that quickly than they would have done if the bug never happened. Similarly, okay, velocity quality balance. Like, this is really hard. Like, this is arguably one of the hardest problems in all of software engineering, is how to get this right. And you're probably never going to get this quite right, and it's going to be an eternal balancing act, and that's fine. But to me, that's basically, if you're going to ship fast, you're going to ship with some bugs sometimes, right? If you try and eliminate all the bugs and ship fast with no bugs, you're not going to ship fast at all. You're just going to ship really slowly. And if you just entirely prioritize velocity, you're just going to ship a lot of bugs, and people are not going to be very happy with that at all. And also, that's when you work in this way, even in a relatively short time scale, that's when your tech debt ends up getting ramped up and up and up. Robot pedantry, human empathy. What do I mean by that? Well, I've got another kind of blog post and stuff like that about this, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail if you're interested. But the TLDR for that, for me, is essentially I am just like addicted to automation. Anything that can be automated away should, in my mind, be automated away. The reason why I call it human empathy in that is because at the time there was a bit of stuff kind of going on in GitHub where people were being like, hey, like we can also automate welcoming people to our project and telling them good job and kissing our loved ones goodbye before we go on a trip and parenting. Okay, like there's a level at which it goes too far, but like generally people are very tolerant of letting robots, I guess, when I said it back there, I meant, stupid CI jobs rather than AI agents or whatever. But basically, people are way more tolerant of Rubicop or a CI build going, you need to fix your style here, 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 here. If you got a coworker in the same team who expressed exactly the same intent, they would not be very well liked, right? But it's okay. We don't have to like the robots. They're coming for us, so why like them? So essentially, one of the practices I've tried to adopt, particularly on Homebrew, but on most kind of projects I've worked on, is if you see the same review comments coming up again and again and again on multiple PRs, if you see the same classes of bugs coming up again and again and again, then figuring out how can we automate catching this so it's not a human who's having to do this every time. My goal in my projects, which periodically bites me, is to essentially be such that, say, like a dependency update, if CI is green, I can just merge. I don't need to read the release notes. I don't need to read the diff. CI is green, I have confidence the app is working. And 99.99% of the time, that is true. And the rest of the time, I have a bad day. Okay, again, let's get actually more specific about what I'm talking about. I've talked about some principles we should be adopting. I've talked about what we're optimizing for. But let's go into the nitty-gritty of like what I actually recommend. Let's name some actual tools. Right, so I'm going to clump these into a few groups. They're maybe a little bit tenuous, the buckets. I apologize, but this is a talk, so what can you do? I'm defining linters as anything that helps you catch issues in either local development or automated test environments. They are probably not running in any form in production, and they are basically good at screaming at you about things that may be a problem or may not be a problem so that humans don't have to do the same thing. So number one for me is, our everybody's friend and everyone's enemy, Rubicop. I try and lean really, really, really hard into Rubicop personally. I've seen in Homebrew, as our adoption has gone up of Rubicop, it has really, really helped us, particularly there where we're accepting lots of external contributions, on having a consistent style across the entire code base. My take is enable essentially everything you can in a tool like Rubicop and then disable what you don't want, and that's fine. I also have seen various degrees of trust in things like Rubicop's ability to auto-correct things. I personally, I guess having done it at Homebrew and GitHub, have a very, very high degree of trust in Rubicop's safe auto-corrections, and just feel free to run that en masse over 1 million lines of source code. And in my experience, for like the enabled by default Rubicop cops, you will not see bugs from doing that. It is, when they say safe, they mean safe. I'm sure people in the room have different experiences and will disagree, but I'm making myself a sacrificial lamb for this one. Right, number 2 on my list is ERB lint. Essentially, Rubicop and a few other bits and pieces that run on your ERB gets your views looking nice, gets your views looking somewhat more consistent with the rest of the code in your code base, and also catches a few other bits and pieces there as well. Better HTML, that's more of like a runtime thing, which is kind of seeing and making sure that your HTML is like roughly consistent and well formatted and stuff like that. Again, this is kind of more of a development time check when you're editing views and stuff like that. Better HTML will go and basically throw up big errors for stuff that just looks like that your browser would probably handle just fine, but we can get some nicer HTML, so let's do that. I have no idea how to say this word, but I'm going to call it prosopite. This is an, who knows what an N+1 is? Folks in the room? Yeah, a lot. Who has had to deal with someone joining the team who didn't know what an N+1 is, and then, yeah. So anyone who doesn't know what an N+1 is, that is essentially, the class example would be if you do something in a Rails view, you have maybe a .each, and you're looping over something, then an N+1 would be when each run through that each, you're ending up doing a separate database query. So you're querying the same table, quite possibly, again and again and again. So say you might display a page where you list 10 users, you're going, hey, user table, I want this. Hey, user table, I want this. Hey, user table, I want this, rather than doing a single query where you query everything in advance and then pass it through to the view. Prosopite, it's a bit fiddly. It doesn't work all of the time, but it's pretty good at catching a lot of these things. Again, if you enable it in development and test, then you can get a nice situation where you stop yourself from being bitten by N+1s in production, and you catch more of them in development instead. This is a slightly more weird, abstract one that almost certainly none of you care about, except maybe CTO types. But it's one of those tools where if you use it sooner rather than later, you'll probably be glad. It came out of GitHub. It's called licensed. It's basically a sort of linter for what licenses of your dependencies you have in your code base. So you can plug it into like Go, NPM, Ruby gems, and basically just be like, okay, what licenses are all these things under? You may not care about open source licensing. Few people do. And if you do, I feel sympathy for you as a kindred spirit. But it's one of those things where it's very easy to not care until it bites you in the ass. I don't know if anyone heard about the Winamp stuff in the last couple of weeks, where, yeah, essentially there was a bunch of stuff where people had just not been following the licenses, and they've taken the repo off GitHub, and there was some drama and whatever. But I mean, people can legitimately end up in court and being sued for this stuff. And it probably won't affect Winamp because it's more or less a defunct company or product or whatever at this point. But like, this is real things that destroys companies, right? So, and it's really not that hard to just have a list of licenses that are standardized and approved and stuff like that. So I would recommend getting on this train when you can. It's also, if you're someone who is in a startup and you have VCs or other maybe very security-focused companies who need to do an audit of you, it's really nice to be able to have the information they need like instantly, rather than being like, yes, I will go through my gem file and individually check the license of all of the software in there. Right, action lint, again, not super exciting thing, but if you're using, who's using GitHub Actions nowadays? Yeah, lots of people. Basically just make sure your GitHub Action workflows are more likely to work before you push the commit than not, and also avoids those cases which you've probably all had where you push the commit and you've managed to fuck the workflow file in GitHub Actions sufficiently such that it won't just run any of your CI anymore at all. No errors, it will just be like, bad YAML. So yeah, let's not have that. Let's run action lint. And then ESLint, because inevitably, as much as we don't want to, we're probably all gonna have to write some JavaScript at some point. Finally, I mean, as this list of 7 things already probably indicates, I'm basically addicted to linters. So if you see anything here, they're like, Mike, there's another linter you should really try. I mean, my coworkers will probably say, please don't send that to me, but please send that to me. Anything I can lint, I want to lint. If you just wanted to take my opinion for it and just like dump this shit straight in your gem file, it would be something like this. Similarly, when you're configuring Rubicop, remember, if you put stuff in your gem file, you need to remember to actually require it in here, otherwise Rubicop might not do it. You also probably want to remember, this is another kind of common gotcha, is set your target Ruby version, because if you're using a nice newer version of Ruby, then you can get additional things which nudge you to use or not use, depending on your preference, newer Ruby syntax features. If you're really wild like me, then new cops and enable by default just means as soon as Rubicop adds any cop, no matter how weird or broken it is, you'll get it straight away. But then I like that because I prefer to then be like, okay, I can individually disable those cops and whatever. And then remember, like, rather than disabling a cop globally, if you want to, you can just say, hey, turns out these migration files are auto-generated, so I actually don't really care about the layout of them. Thanks very much. Similarly, a pattern I would encourage you to do if you're really into linters like me, and I apologize in advance for the at least 2 people in here who will continue to get me making these comments on every code review until I die, that if you disable a linter, please consider adding a comment above the linter explaining why you're disabling the linter. Now, this might seem really, really annoying, but it is actually useful to do this stuff because often in cases like this is a particularly good example because it actually states a thing that in future may not be true. So we want to actually explain why I've done that rather than just be like, oh, I actually don't care. And also, this is a linter that I imagine may have literally triggered some of you in the room because it's essentially any time you do anything that is going to skip the model validations, you have to explicitly disable the linter and add a comment. So in our code base, there's a few of these comments, and I can suspect some of you right now are being like, this seems very silly and pointless. Why are you doing this? But bear with me. I will come to that. Right, on to tests. So I'm defining tests as a little bit more loosely than we might otherwise do. I'm basically going to call it anything that requires the developer to actually write additional code that is not run in production to catch problems. And also, again, maybe slightly controversially, you actually want as few of these as you can to maximally exercise your code base. So we're using RSpec on Workbrew mainly because we're using it on Homebrew. I actually don't care very much about whether you use RSpec or Minitest. We were talking about this over dinner last night. I feel like if you do want to write RSpec, consider, again, Rubocops for RSpec that will make your RSpec actually look like nice RSpec and not just Minitest in another name. Simplecov, I don't know whether you do code coverage stuff. Shout out to GitHub who didn't, and it was very annoying. But it's generally, even if you're not aiming for a particular number or guarding on code coverage or whatever, it's generally useful to be able to run a given test or a given test suite and say, which lines did this actually run? So you have an idea of what's being tested or not. Playwright, I'll come back to this in a minute, but basically if you're using Selenium to drive your Rails system tests, and you're like, why is this so flaky all the time? It's because of Selenium. If you switch to Playwright, everything gets way less flaky almost immediately. I have a citation for that in a minute. VCR, again, I imagine most of you use that perhaps already. If you don't, VCR lets you, essentially the first time you run a test that hits a remote endpoint, it lets you store the response from that endpoint, and then that will be replayed like a VCR cassette every time you run that test. So it's a kind of nice middle ground between like just mocking out the request and having tests that actually hit remote endpoints, because it means you can run them offline, it means your output is stable, but then you do actually have the way to basically check, okay, this is actually what the production data looks like, and then you could re-record the cassette in VCR's terminology in future to get better production data and then update it and whatever. Similarly, parallel tests. We've all got lots of cores on our laptops now. Let's make them work. Unfortunately, you don't get, they removed a feature when you got Apple Silicon Macs in that it no longer heats up your room quite as effectively and makes that noise that we all loved with our Intel Macs. But it's still useful for running things much faster, in my experience. And like I set this up for our code base the other day, and it took me like, I don't know, a couple of hours. And more than halved the speed of our test suite. So consider doing that. CodeCov, it's got a free tier. It's like a paid product and stuff. I'll show you an example in a minute of like the one thing I love with CodeCov. But basically, code coverage tool as a service plugs into SimpleCov, and bear with me, and I'll show you the cool thing. And then finally, GitHub Actions. Mentioned that already, but essentially, you're probably going to want to run those tests somewhere. But in general, as I said before, like I want to just automate everything. So I push a bunch of stuff into GitHub Actions that maybe has no business being there, but I like it. On Playwright versus Selenium, if you are not convinced by me just stating something as a fact, go see my friend Justin Searles' post on this that explains kind of how he transitioned this over and why, and I think you will also have a good time. On CodeCov, this is essentially like the single nicest feature I think that you get from CodeCov, and really the only thing I care about in the entire product, which is if you have a code base that has more than 0% coverage and less than 100%, you can have on individual PRs, it will comment being like, hey, this particular line was not hit by any of the tests in your test suite. And this is really useful, not because every single time you see this box, you have to write a new test, because particularly with stuff like Homebrew, that's not always completely practical, but because it at least lets you be more scared, I guess, when you're reviewing the code. When I am reviewing a PR and I see a lot more of these than usual, then I'm like, okay, I need to basically do the job that the test suite might otherwise be doing. As an example of stuff that I excessively automate, I have a GitHub action that basically just essentially on every PR pretty much will like run Rubocop and try and auto-correct all the offenses, and then push. Same with ERB lint, same with sorbet, which I'll come to later. And then you can get like nightly jobs as well. They do nice little things like this, where, again, if there's a new bundler version, it would just open a PR, and then a human, like my colleague Carlo and I, can review this, and then we can just merge it, and it saves a human from having to go and manually create this PR and check it out and merge it and whatever. Right. So I'm going to speed through the last little bits because I'm running a little bit low on time. This is our test suite in Workbrew. I was telling you it's nice to see 10 different processes. And this is the like vaguely interesting bit. I don't show this really as a flex, but because I guess on test coverage, I would vaguely encourage you, if you're anywhere close to 100% test coverage, to get to 100% test coverage and then make it mandatory, because some magical things happen when you have it, which is like, you don't have dead code anymore, because once you have dead code, it becomes a blocking thing for your tests, and you end up deleting the dead code unless you have silly tests that execute dead code, and then you can delete them as well. And it can encourage you to lean into your type system a little bit more as well, which I'll talk about shortly. If you want to just copy my gem file again, that's what's there. Right. Monitoring. I imagine we all have some sort of monitoring tools. I'm really not going to dwell on this because I don't really care. But essentially, you want some sort of error or performance monitoring tool of your choice. My choice is Sentry. You want some sort of logging tool of your choice. My tool is Logtail. You want some sort of alerting, monitoring, on-call tool of choice. My tool is BetterStack. If you do that with these gems, there you go. You can get woken up in the night about your crappy code. So finally, types. In Ruby, this basically means pick which of the type systems you want to use. I have picked, and it is sorbet. I have used sorbet at GitHub and Homebrew and Workbrew, and it works great in all of the cases I've used it. And some people hate it, but they hate it less over time. This is an example of what it might look like if I was using sorbet. This is very much like a happy path sort of sorbet usage, where I can say, OK, I've created this view component here. I'm taking in a user. I know that it's a user because I've told you it's a user. I know that I'm going to give back a user. And here I've got this user here. The thing that's notable about this, which I want you to pay attention to, is at no point do I ever check if they passed a no user in there or a nil in there, because this is actually being verified both at runtime and at like check time by sorbet. And therefore, that nil class thing we saw earlier on, essentially, if you lean in hard enough, if you use sorbet in strict mode of your entire code base, you too can never see nil class method not available in production again. And this is the type of thing you might want to add to your gem file. So finishing up, I expect this is the part where I guess we can get some nice ad hominems in there. You could say, wow, Mike, it's very easy for you to say you're working on this greenfield project. I saw you've got like 3 tests. Your code base obviously has like 6 lines of code at this point. Like, yeah, OK. Some of us are dealing with real problems, OK? Yeah, OK, yeah, it is easier for me than it is for you. But then again, you know, I do stuff on Homebrew. Homebrew's code base has been around for like 15 years. Like GitHub, when I worked there, their code base was around for, you know, I guess, more than 15, coming up to sort of 20 years. Like, perfect is the enemy of good. You can always make things better. In Homebrew and in GitHub, many of the tools I mentioned, certainly tools like Sorbet and Rubicop, were adopted incrementally over time. And in the case of Sorbet, went from 0 to non-zero, and that made the code quality better. There is no app too big in the world to adopt these tools. You can always get to a better place from where you are today. Finally, I guess another common objection perhaps to my approach with this stuff is like, Mike, this sounds really oppressive and overwhelming. Like you've got just like all of these robots shouting at you all the time, and you've enabled all these things, and you're trying to get 100% test coverage, and doesn't this just suck all the joy out of it? No, because you too can cheat. So what I do is I have all of these like guardrails I built for myself to try and make me do good code. And I will liberally just do things where I rewrite code to have 100% line coverage by essentially putting a branch on 1 line instead of 2, right? And is that somewhat stupid? Yes. Is that maybe a really weird and bad attitude? Yes. But it still gets to a better place, I think, than if you don't set these guardrails at all. Again, perfect is the enemy of good. You're still going to end up with dramatically better code from trying to have more guardrails. And it'll make you and your team and your customers / users happier. The key to success is knowing when to break your own rules. Let's just not tell the robots that. If you have any questions, then we're not doing it now, but you can send me an email or find me on the internet. And if you want to read a blog post of this talk, it went out about an hour ago, and you can see it at this URL. Thank you very much.